last time we were talking about the Second Ecumenical Council, the General Council of Constantinople, some of which was not approved by the Pope. So that means that therefore that canon, remember the one that supposedly says that the patriarchs of Constantinople have the second position in the hierarchy of the church after the See of Rome itself. That canon was never approved, meaning that it was invalid. It counts for nothing. Yeah, that is also something that's purely disciplinary, because all such titles of the order of precedence among the various dioceses throughout the world, all of that is 100% to be determined by the Pope. There is nothing of, we'll say, divine establishment when it comes to that. That is definitely that the Holy See, the See of the Pope, is the first See, most definitely. But after that, it's completely at the discretion of the Pope which See is the next in dignity, second, third, and so on and so forth. And so this particular canon never being approved carries no weight. It is generally true that when you have a schema, or when you have the plural schemata of doctrinal decrees that were prepared to be presented to a council, but were perhaps never promulgated because never voted on, there are such schemata from the First Vatican Council, which was never put on hold at a certain point and was never resumed technically, which is technically still on. There are those schemata that were never actually presented, or they didn't get around to that. That was on the agenda, but it never got around to it. The fathers of the council never got around to it before the council was prorogued. Those schemata still have authority as the result of the work of highly learned minds that were deemed of sufficient learning, sufficient expertise to present documents, to prepare documents to be presented to a council. So that holds a certain authority all of its own because of the learning of those who prepared them, and the fact that they were deemed worthy or sufficient, had been reviewed sufficiently so as to be considered worthy to be presented to a council. Such a document is valuable in its own right, even if it was not actually contained in the definitions and the promulgations of any particular council by the Pope himself. It's something similar to the way in which works of theologians have authority because of the learning and expertise of those who have written them. Those works have authority all on their own, and of course the schemata presented to councils are the works of many such theologians. So it stands to reason that they should have authority all on their own. But yet those are doctrinal schemata that we're talking about. This is a purely disciplinary canon, or try this particular canon that was rejected was trying to be a disciplinary canon for the council. We can put it that way. And being rejected as such carries no weight whatsoever. These are things that the Pope can change at will, which See is considered to be higher than another See in dignity. And the fact that he makes that decision is the reason why it has that dignity. The Pope is the one who imparts that to it. So any claims that because Constantinople is the second Rome, the council, the capital of the empire was moved to Constantinople, that therefore the See of Constantinople must necessarily be second in dignity to that of Rome, that argument carries nothing. It carries no weight whatsoever. So that particular canon rejected. The Pope never promulgated it. No, it's never promulgated by any Pope, therefore worthless. So, Pope St. Leo the Great in 451 AD in his letter to the Council of Chalcedon, where the heretic Nestorius was condemned. Now, remember, right now we're looking at the reign of Pope St. Damasus I. Pope St. Leo the Great, in a letter to the Council of Chalcedon, declares that by this want of sanction, want of approval, this particular canon had been from the first utterly nullified, and he sums up the apostolic tradition touching the rank of the patriarchs in this invariable rule: the See of Alexandria shall lose nothing of the dignity it derives from St. Mark, the disciple of St. Peter. The Church of Antioch, birthplace of the name of Christian, by the preaching of the same apostle, shall keep, as I say, St. Peter, shall keep the rank assigned it by the regulation of our fathers. Let it never lose its place as third in order. So the See of Antioch was, you may recall, the first place where St. Peter established his see, his seat. So that's a feast of the church it's in February, the See of St. Peter at Antioch, the church, St. Peter's chair at Antioch. The one for Rome is in January. Those are feasts considered to be feasts of St. Peter, feast of the day of the establishment of his see in two different places. First, he was in Antioch. First, established himself in Antioch, and then after that, moved to Rome. And indeed, St. Peter did go to Rome. There, heretics who object to the notion that he was in Rome. He most certainly was in Rome. No question whatsoever about it. So the Second Ecumenical Council, Second General Council of the Catholic Church, closed with a great solemnity, attending the translation, that is the moving, of the relics of St. Paul, Patriarch of Constantinople, who had died for the faith under Constantius. So this is this is even mentioned in the Martyrology, actually, the translatio, which simply means the moving across, latio, bearing across. You hear the word translation in English, it usually refers to the translation of some passage from, or some expression, some sentence, etc., from one language to another. The translatio of relics means the moving. Yeah. This is the translation of the relics, to use that term, is just lifting the Latin translatio, which, as you know, the Latin word is almost always of significantly broader meaning than the modern cognate. So translation is has a significantly more restricted meaning than translatio in Latin. In this right here, the translation is just to be looked upon as a lifting of translatio from Latin into English. So the moving of the relics of St. Paul, Patriarch of Constantinople. So sometimes it's interesting to see how relics of saints are, in a sense, fought over sometimes. That's why you may have heard about the body of St. Thomas coming to Washington, D.C. soon. There's a question, there are two skulls that are supposedly St. Thomas Aquinas. So, St. Thomas was not deformed in that way. He only had one head. So he could not possibly have had more than one skull. And at this point, barring any significant advancement in technology, such as DNA testing and whatnot, it's impossible to know which is the actual one. There's a whole story to that, which is a little too far outside the scope of what we're talking about here to go into. But still, there is a question of which is the actual skull of St. Thomas. So it's sometimes, yes, you can see that the relics of saints are, in a sense, fought over. So the Second Ecumenical Council closed with the moving of the relics of St. Paul, Patriarch of Constantinople, not to be confused with, of course, St. Paul the Apostle. The acts of the council were sent to the Pope, and Photius, who states the fact, positively asserts that Blessed Damasus, by his authority, confirmed the Second Council. Notice, this council held in Constantinople, which is a constant source of trouble for the Church. And at this time, this is long before the Phocian Schism. Photius was the first real troublemaker to cause major schism in the East that lasted any significant amount of time. Definitely these heretics are being rebellious, that we've been seeing, but it was Photius who really started the trend of the whole of the East going into schism. The whole, not to a man, but the East generally going into schism. Many centuries later, this is Photius, for whom the reason why Phocian is a general term for an Eastern schismatic. Phocians, the name for Photius, who really started the trend. He was not, during his lifetime, it did not, the one that he started did not last too long, but he definitely caused it. And notice that at a certain point, yes, he himself admitted that this council, the Second General Council of the Catholic Church, which everybody, East and West, admits to being a true council of the Catholic Church, that this was confirmed by the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And notice that these schismatics, they do not deny that the Pope has authority. They just deny his authority in the East. They say he's the Bishop of Rome. He's the real Bishop of Rome. They would not deny that. But they say that he's only the Bishop of Rome, or they restrict his where exactly they say the limits of his authority are may or may not end with the see with the limits of the See of Rome. You'd have to see what they say to figure out what exactly is the figment of their imagination that they act in accordance with. But definitely they say that he doesn't have authority in the East. So they admit that he has authority, just not in the East, not where they are. Whereas here, clearly, the Photius himself, the man himself, the scoundrel himself, admits that the Pope, at the time, Pope St. Damasus, everybody acknowledged, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, whom everybody acknowledged to have authority, the plenitude of jurisdiction everywhere in the Catholic Church, that he confirmed this council. And it's only because of that, obviously, that it has any value whatsoever. So that'll come into play down the line, in a few hundred years down the line, which we'll not see this year, but that will come into play later on. So don't forget about that. While the integrity of the faith was thus maintained in the East, the Council of Saragossa in Spain, 380 AD, had condemned the Priscillianists, who had already infected the greater part of Spain with their error. So see, the West is not full of, it's not completely free of problems. No place in this Vale of Tears is perfectly free of problems, but notice that there are significantly fewer problems in the West. Whoever talks about the Priscillianists, anyway. Everybody knows, you talk about Arians, everybody knows that immediately. You talk about the Nestorians, everybody knows that immediately. Everybody's at least heard of those. Anybody with any knowledge, really, of the history of the Catholic Church has at least heard of those. Those are heresies and heretics of which you've at least heard the name. Whereas Priscillianists, whoever talks about that, so yes, it's an error, it's a heresy, but it's heresy, we can, most likely even in the technical sense, we'll see exactly what censure it deserves, but clearly it was not the problem that the heresies in the East were. Priscillian, so we still keep tabs on these, there are always problems. Priscillian, from whom the sect borrowed its name, had been the disciple of an Egyptian Manichae named Mark. So, his doctrine was but a tissue of the errors of Manes, for whom Manichaeism is named, with a mingling of Gnostic visions and astrological absurdities. A few bishops, amongst whom were Instantius and Savian, again, nobody ever talks about them, had fallen into this heresy which was condemned with its authors. So it's just another Manichaeism is, remember, as we have a notion mentioned here, is just a repackaging, perhaps a rearrangement to some degree of Gnosticism. That's Gnosticism has, in a sense, never really gone out of style. Its influence remains in various ways to this very day. And you may remember last year looking at the early Gnostics, how completely insane their systems were. Just off the wall, crazy, absurd. It was so crazy that the term heresy really doesn't, definitely they said heretical things, but it's so crazy that it's bigger than just a heresy. It's just how it could be better described as an insane mythological system, one of whose characters happens to be called Christ. They applied the title of Christ to one of these characters in their insane imaginings. The system, whatever you want to even call it, that it's so crazy. So Gnosticism is really more a mythological system than a single heresy. Now, you definitely, let's make no mistake, they definitely said heretical things, but it's bigger than that. So Gnosticism, its influence remains to this day. Manichaeism was really repackaged Gnosticism, and you see now Priscillianism repackaged Manichaeism. There's really nothing new under the sun. So, the close of the year 381 AD, St. Ambrose was presiding at Aquileia in a provincial council of Italy for the condemnation of Palladius and Secundianus, two Illyrian bishops, and the only prelates in all the West who still held at the time the Arian doctrines. So, less Arianism in the West. The ravages of Manichaeism in Egypt, in the north of Africa, and in the provinces of Syria determined Theodosius the Great, at least Darius calls him that. I'm not aware that that's always a title given to him, usually Theodosius the First. Well, he did certain very good things for the church, but he was not perfect, which we'll see. But even that, actually, it's true, he was very good in many ways, and one of the ways in which he was good was the way in which he repented of the one major crime that can definitely be imputed to his name, so we'll get to that. So, the Emperor Theodosius, determined to publish against these heresies a law enjoining the Praetorian prefect of the East to establish an inquisition to seek out and pursue them. So you see now the legal structures of the empire are now being used, instead of to persecute the faith, are being used to punish heresy, which is correct. An inquisition, usually that comes to mind, so we haven't mentioned here the fact that this is the first appearance of the name inquisitor against the heretics in the history of the church. Also would not be the last. Most famously, of course, you have the Spanish Inquisition, which is something for a different era of church history. And also the Roman Inquisition, which eventually became the Holy Office. So that, in some way, one way or another, that still exists in the current discipline of the church. Because the Novus Ordo has changed the name of the Holy Office, obviously, first it was the Congregation for the Defense of the Doctrine of the Faith, or something like that. Anyway, first abbreviated to CDF, which the joke is the Congregation for the Destruction of the Faith, which is what they work for. But even now, they don't use in the Novus Ordo, they have to be ever more pretentious. Now they've stopped using the term congregation, and now they use the term dicastery or something like that, which the things have not changed any more than the Novus Ordo has destroyed them, but they just, the more pretentious, the more high sounding and therefore more pretentious sounding anything is, the better it is for the Novus Ordo. That's just it's a revolution that they're carrying out, so they have to be constantly changing things from what it was before. The more the differences they have from the traditional practice of the faith and the running of the church, the better, as far as they're concerned. So they just have to change everything down to the tiniest labels. They have to change, and I mean that's a big thing, but nothing is. You think you're just, why would they just not leave the title of the Holy Office? What's wrong with that? Maybe it's the term holy, but they have to change everything. So, Inquisitor. Most famously, the Spanish Inquisition was established for the purpose of weeding out false converts to the faith in Spain. And one thing to be noted on this while we're on it, we're not going to go into detail on that now, but that the Spanish Inquisition was a state-run operation. Again, in a situation where church and state were united, so there were definitely ecclesiastics involved, but ultimately, if you have to classify it as an ecclesiastical establishment or a civil one, it was actually a civil establishment, a civil organization established by the government of Spain. So people who like to use that as an accusation against the church, that was ultimately an organ of the Spanish government, which was run by Catholics, definitely. And with the cooperation of ecclesiastics, the church it was not something evil in itself. It's just that it was ultimately not run by the church. So any accusations that might be made on the basis of any possible abuse, which is ultimately what any accusation must be reduced to, the pointing out of some particular abuse on some particular occasion of something that was in itself good. Those accusations are to be really laid at the feet of the Spanish government. If you want to accuse the organization, you have to accuse the Spanish government, not the Catholic Church. You might accuse yes, you may be able to find instances of abuse in which ecclesiastics were involved, but those abuses were never approved by the church. So any institutional blame, so to speak, belongs to the Spanish government in that case, of which there might be particular cases of it, but it wasn't itself something good and in fact necessary. When you see the situation, when you closely examine the situation, you realize this was perfectly reasonable in itself, again, assuming that you understand the necessity of adhering to the Catholic faith and the obligation that nations have, no less than individuals, to adhere to it, adopt it, and recognize it as the only true religion. When you recognize that, then you see that it's in fact a perfectly reasonable thing. And you see, it was really by time the Spanish government undertook it many centuries later, in fact over a millennium later, it was nothing new. The Inquisitions were nothing new. There have always been, certainly in the Catholic Church, and then in states which recognize the necessity of expunging heresy, there have always been ways of rooting out heretics. It's just perfectly normal. Again, in a place where people have their heads screwed on right, it's recognized as necessary and perfectly reasonable. It's only because of the insanity of the Enlightenment that it's now seen as something horrible. Whatever abuses there may have been, blown out of all proportion for the purpose of trying to make it seem as horrible as possible. All right, so more on that next time. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, men sub tuum presidium refugimus, Sancta Rei Genitrix, nostras et peccatinis et despicias, in necessitatibus et periclis cunctis, libera nos semper, Virgo gloriosa et benedicta. Amen. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.